This video covers the material from Chapter 3. So I'll talk about correctional facilities from the 17th century or the 1800s to today. One of the first well-known correctional facilities in the United States, aside from the supposed first jail in Virginia in 1606, was the Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia. Originally, people had referred to this as a jail, but later scholars had designated it as a prison because it was remodeled to include individual cells. So if you are familiar with the differences, or if you're unfamiliar, with the differences between jails and prisons, we can be sure to discuss that in class. Anyways, this facility was based on reforms envisioned for the English and European jails, and ideally it was to be operated based on religious beliefs that emphasized reflective study of the Bible. And we had discussed this previously, that inmates were supposed to have solitary time to reflect on their behavior and ultimately repent or develop remorse and sorrow for their actions. Unfortunately, in 1810, there was a fire that ruined part of the facility, and that led to worsening conditions and more crowded conditions. And so the reforms that it was originally trying to follow were not successful. And later, this particular facility was replaced by the Eastern State Penitentiary, which we'll talk about here momentarily. So now we're going to cover a couple different approaches to incarceration. So we're going to discuss the Pennsylvania model and then the New York model. So to begin with, the Pennsylvania model it's also known as the separate system. So the Pennsylvania model is also referred to as the separate system. One example of this type of facility is the Western Pennsylvania Prison, and that was opened in 1821. The purpose of the separate system, so the Pennsylvania model in general, was to keep inmates from interacting with each other because the operators of the facilities feared contamination, and so social contamination, that is, not literal, but social as in ideas and beliefs and things like that between the inmates. So here are some pictures of that Western Pennsylvania prison. You can see it's right on the water. There were no programs at the facility, this particular facility, the Western Pennsylvania prison, and prisoners stayed in single cells. You can see in this particular photo the size of the cells were fairly small. This particular facility ended up closing in 2017. Another example of the type of prison under the Pennsylvania prison model is Eastern PA prison. This was opened in 1829. So this, again, is one of the examples of the separate system. So it's also known as the Eastern State Penitentiary, which is also known as Cherry Hill. So it closed in 1971, but you can go online and actually get a virtual tour of the facility. But anyway, so this particular facility had replaced the Walnut Street Jail. So remember I had mentioned that early on. The Walnut Street Jail was seen as the first jail, and then some people refer to it as a prison. And it eventually had a fire in the 1800s, and so that was no longer in use. And the Eastern State Penitentiary replaced that Walnut Street Jail. So the Eastern State Penitentiary was built in the late 1820s, like I had said, 1829. At that time, it was the largest building in America, and it held about 250 inmates. And cells were approximately 15 feet by 7.5 feet. This particular facility, as it was following the separate system, had inmates were kept isolated from each other, and so inmates really only had contact with clergy members and vocational teachers and things like that. Initially, there were no work programs offered because the facility, again, did not want inmates in contact with each other. But given that the size of the cells were a little bit larger, later on, inmates were allowed to actually work in their cells. Something interesting about this particular facility is that it was known for implementing the use of numbers to differentiate between inmates, and it did not use names. Again, that was another thing to reinforce the isolation and separation. So as the separate system kept inmates isolated from each other, there were some psychological issues associated with that approach. So if you think back to those 6 justifications of punishment that we talked about previously in Chapter 1, including retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, rehabilitation, reintegration, and restoration. So if you recall those 6, the separate system was really criticized because the complete lack of contact between human beings did not facilitate rehabilitation or reintegration. So even though the separate system was supposed to provide inmates with the opportunity to reflect on their behavior and repent, instead many of them suffered from serious psychological problems from the isolation. And the rehabilitative potential of the separate system was debated, although, as you may know, separation and solitary confinement continue to be utilized in facilities even to this day. So in contrast to the Pennsylvania model, or the separate system, is the New York prison model, which is also known as the congregate system or congregate model, and is also known as the Auburn model. So I will use the terms New York model and congregate system interchangeably. So the congregate system had prohibited the use of solitary confinement and isolation, and this occurred largely after 1822. But even though it prohibited isolation, it still discouraged interaction between inmates. So inmates were separated at night, and then during the day in many of these types of prisons, they were not supposed to interact much. So one example of the congregate system is the Auburn facility, which is still open today. It opened in 1817, although it wasn't actually finished being built until 1819. But the cells themselves are pretty small. They're 7 feet by 3.5 feet. And the purpose of that was because since inmates were generally only sleeping in their cells, that they worked out in a congregate system during the day, that they didn't actually need a lot of space in their cells because they were only sleeping there. So in this particular type of facility, the prison model that New York State followed was, again, separation at night, but congregate during the day, but notably, they were supposed to not interact much. So even if they were working in programs during the day, inmates were supposed to be silent. The evaluations of the Pennsylvania model and the New York model, or evaluations of the separate system and the congregate systems, generally preferred the New York model or the congregate model. However, Each of those types of facilities were, despite that those facilities were trying to address some of the issues that existed before the 1700s, reforms were still needed. So some lingering problems with correctional facilities that continued and continue today include poor staffing, overcrowding, and the continued use of solitary confinement. And so all of these things led to some issues in facilities, such as contraband, some psychological issues among inmates, for example. So, despite all of these attempts at reforming correctional institutions, there were still a lot of reforms needed. So, the problems that persisted prompted the 1870 Prison Congress, which established a set of principles for prison reform. And the Declaration of Principles that was enacted had the goal of reforming people, not just vindictively punishing offenders, torturing them, or locking them up and warehousing them. So hopefully you can see where some of the justifications of punishment were prominent at different points throughout history. Because, for example, with the Declaration of Principles, it was the idea that we were, as a society, to move away from retribution, to move away from incapacitation, and really move towards rehabilitation and reintegration, for example. So after the Declaration of Principles was enacted, a handful of facilities tried to implement changes that were consistent with the reform principles. The Elmira facility in New York was intended to be a facility that promoted rehabilitation and reintegration with both educational and vocational and other types of training. And when it opened, Zebulon Brockway was the head of the facility, and Brockway followed Alexander Makonicki's ideas of earning good time. So if you remember with Makonicki's, he was in charge of the Norfolk Island, the penal colony off the coast of Australia, and he kind of implemented or started this idea of good time, which is now known as parole. So the Elmira facility had a marks system that enabled some prisoners to be released early depending on their behavior. And the system gave offenders both discipline and punishment, but it rewarded good behavior with the incentive of having a shorter sentence. So we'll talk more about parole and indeterminate sentencing later on in the semester, but this is an introduction to that. So the goal of this facility at the time was to become a model prison and to set the tone for future correctional institutions. So even though it had all of these lofty goals, unfortunately, a lack of funding really prevented the facility from implementing the desired reforms that were following the Declaration of Principles. So in contrast to the Pennsylvania and New York prison models, there was a different picture of correctional institutions in the South. So specifically, it's argued that correctional facilities in the South were designed to recreate slavery. Before the Civil War, which was in 1861 to 1865, jails and prisons weren't as commonplace because of the existence of slavery. So thinking back to some of the earlier chapters and the earlier types of punishments, like galley slavery and bridewells, those were types of punishments used to control the poor. So in the context of the South in the United States, slavery was used to control people of color. And the 13th Amendment in the United States Constitution states, and I quote, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction, end quote. So essentially, the 13th Amendment had outlined that slavery was prohibited except for a punishment of crime. So many scholars argue that lengthy sentences of incarceration in the South and elsewhere increased as a way for white people to maintain power and control over people of color. So we'll talk more about race and the criminal justice system in a later chapter, but if you are interested in knowing more about this, there's a documentary called 13th that's available on Netflix that talks a lot about this idea of incarceration replacing slavery. So finally, from the 1960s forward, the U.S. incarceration rate has increased substantially. The United States has one of the highest incarceration rate in the world. And given the sheer number of people who are incarcerated, attempts at funding facilities and programs aimed at rehabilitating and reintegrating offenders has generally been unsuccessful. So overcrowding in correctional facilities has become a problem, and because of this, it's become more and more difficult to do anything except incapacitate prisoners. And the pictures on the slide are a good illustration of the types of prisons that we have now, which are very similar to warehouses. And so each of those pictures were from prisons in California, one of which was the California Institution for Men in Chino, California, and then San Quentin, which is in San Francisco. So this concludes the information in Chapter 3.